Yo, hello everyone. Hello. Welcome back to Sweet Talks. I'm Chai.
I'm Kay.
And I'm Rye.
Hello. To start out, I want to explain the layout of this episode a bit. Unfortunately, our recording last week on Friday, the 4th of December, we had to delete it due to some unfortunate events. But we're back and we're super excited to do that. And we really wanted to do it on Monday because we really wanted to have this conversation. We each felt that there were some good points that were addressed in the last podcast. Um, but we're going to revisit it today. We're going to talk more. And in fact, we're probably going to actually expand it because there were some things that happened in the last few days from like YouTube videos that we watch or other readings that we've done that we also want to bring into this conversation. So we apologize for the unusual timing right now, but this Friday we're going to start back at 5:30 on our normal time. So look forward to seeing you then. So now we're going to start with today. So today's conversation, which we are continuing with our series, Who Has a Place in K-Pop? But we'll be looking at it from a different angle. We'll be discussing the discrepancy that we've seen between what is acceptable or seen as valuable in pop culture versus what is acceptable in daily life, or rather what is more accurate, or what are the more accurate realities. We'll be touching on the experiences of individuals who are seen as undesirable in both South Korea and Japan, as well as the presence of foreigners. This conversation was sparked by the recent, it's not so recent anymore, but recent-ish Nike ad, Japanese ad that featured the experiences of three young girls in Japan. So, Rai, do you want to explain the ad?
Yeah, so I'll just give a quick outline of what happened in the ad. So it featured three Japanese girls about high school age who all play soccer. One of them was, as far as I could tell, a black hafu, so half black, half Japanese. One it was a Zainichi Korean, which short form they're basically World War II Korean immigrants to Japan. And one is entirely ethnically Japanese as far as they show. But each of these girls, they experience adversity in different ways throughout the ad. For instance, like the black hafu's classmates are playing with her hair in the bathroom, seemingly without her consent. And they kind of treat her with fascination surrounding her non-Japanese features. She's almost like a doll. The Zainichi Korean girl sees herself represented in the news, in particular, as like a Japanese like national problem, and she is the victim of ostracization in her classes. Meanwhile, the fully ethnically Japanese girl is just teased and bullied in school, as well as on the internet for what seems like just simply trying to live her life. You know, so the ad received a lot of backlash for its presentation of discrimination in Japan. In particular, some Japanese individuals were offended at the implication that Japan has any discrimination at all. Um, the arguments regarding why the ad was like inaccurate as far as representation goes were numerous, but they were often also easily disputed just by people's everyday experiences. So this raises important questions about how these societies view themselves, and it also harkens back to our previous comments about the discrepancy between how outsiders are utilized and received in pop media versus how the lives of similar individuals play out in the day-to-day life in these cultures. So my question for our podcasters today, just to start us off, is who are some like visibly foreign or ethnically diverse celebrities that you know of from either Japanese or Korean media? And how are their representations in that media different from or similar to what you know of the lives of regular everyday foreigners or visibly foreign looking people in these societies? Do you see a relationship between
Mm.
the pop culture and more basic cultural experiences.
And I can jump into that.
Okay.
Sorry, Rob. I'm just so eager to talk about this because not only do I think this just like enlightens the conversation, like bring up like a part of our like mission with having these conversations is just to bring awareness to these things that are not as visibly clear during like people's experiences of like wanting to research the countries that they want to visit and things like that. And just me being like a Black woman, I feel like it's important to be aware of maybe the representations of Blackness or just like otherness in these countries, whether that can make me feel a little bit more excited to visit these countries and just like be related, find some relation within these countries to myself, because there is a unique experience just being the only person that looks like yourself visiting these countries. And yeah, and we'll definitely get more into that later on where we touch upon our own personal experiences going to these countries. But speaking from a local and probably domestic example, in South Korea, one of the first people that I've discovered that was not only Korean but also African American was Yoon Mirae, and I was completely kind of like engulfed in her image and just like her beauty and just like her background, the fact that I could even relate to her as being someone who's African American, but she lives all the way in South Korea. And so I was definitely interested in the way that she was portrayed in media and just also like her relationship to South Korea. So based off of what I've heard, brief information that I've looked up, she is a singer, songwriter, music producer in South Korea, mostly within hip hop and R&B. She's also known as a lyricist, someone who can often change from being a rapper to a singer within her craft. And she's very much so involved in her music, and her identity is very much so a part of the way that she expresses herself in her music. She has come out in articles, not as many though, and I think that's very telling of her own experience, in fact, about talking about her experience as a half Korean, half Black woman in South Korea specifically. Now, she does have ties living in the United States, specifically in Texas, but she was, how should I say, a soldier's kid, like an army kid. I don't really know the terms for the children whose parents are from the military, and so therefore they travel a lot, or they're moving back and forth between one of their parents' like home country and then the country that we're born in. So she was born in South Korea. She was very much so close to the military lifestyle living in South Korea. However, based off of the article, I can assume that she did attend public school in South Korea. And so that definitely has its own connotations, because that's where these like projections of, you know, beauty standards and just like being accepted come from. And that's very clear in that Japanese Nike commercial that we saw. School is definitely one of the main centers where you kind of get introduced to society, like the inner workings of society and how you kind of fit in, right? And so briefly, she talked about how the time that she debuted as an artist in South Korea, she experienced discrimination. This is specifically from the article in her words, where she was asked, how was it when you first debuted in Korea? And at the time, there was more prejudice towards mixed people, which is very telling of exactly what we're talking about, is that maybe on the global scale, South Korea seems very inviting because of its like globalization and just like its influx of international, how to say, like international relationships. Like I think that's coming out as well within this. And I mean governmental, maybe not like literally within families. I mean, it did happen, but I'm talking about how South Korea has become more and more globally pronounced because of the fact that they created these relationships with other countries. I'll get more into that later. So back to this question, she answered, I experienced discrimination from both sides. In the US, I wasn't Black enough. In Korea, they called me Yankee. In primary school and middle school, there wasn't a day when I wasn't reminded I was only half Korean. And people stared at me, and it was really hard. And my first label asked me to hide my father's skin color, and they told me, we'll say you have far African American origins. Later, when African American music was the trend, they accepted my darker skin color. And I was angry and lost at the same time. And I put this anger into my songs. So you can definitely tell where this came from, this attitude that kind of is trailing within her music. Not that I think at all it's an aggressive message, but I think it's a profound message that's saying that don't take my Blackness for granted, and like benefiting off of it because you see it as something that is profitable. And before I go too much into that detail, because I feel like that's streamlined throughout our entire conversation tonight about acceptance and the disparity between what's acceptable and just like the nature of acceptance that's happening locally, right? It's very different than what's being projected and how it's being utilized in a day-to-day. And I know that Chai definitely wants to hop in. Yeah.
Yeah, I also want to hop in with some examples. So, Kay, you brought up some great examples of individuals from South Korea. I want to also bring in some individuals from Japan who are also biracial. So the two people that obviously come to mind are Naomi Osaka and Ariana Miyamoto. So I'm going to start with Ariana Miyamoto because I've heard of her in 2015. She was an individual who won Miss Japan in 2015 on like a beauty pageant, nation pageant kind of thing. And she faced a lot of backlash because she wasn't fully Japanese. So you can kind of guess like kind of the discourse around her was it was all about, is she really Japanese enough to represent Japan, even though she's lived in Japan almost her entire life. She speaks the language. So a lot of people were like, is she Japanese enough? A lot of people were upset because there were other individuals who were Japanese who they felt like could have been the one to represent Japan because she was fully Japanese as opposed to Ariana Miyamoto. So I'm talking about her, but I'm also going to talk about Naomi Osaka, and I'm kind of going to link them two similarly together. Naomi Osaka, if y'all don't know, is a tennis player, and she is also a biracial individual. I'm also very excited to talk about her because she is half Japanese and half Haitian. And if y'all don't know, I'm also Haitian. So it was really great to see somebody who's kind of similar to me in such a large scale. And what was really particularly interesting about her experience being a Japanese tennis player is that before she won against Serena Williams, Japan didn't really accept her as Japanese. They saw her as a Black figure, right? They saw her as a Black individual, but because she was Black, she wasn't Japanese. It was like, you are playing for Japan, but you are not Japanese, right? You're not part of our unit. You're not part of the in group. It's when she won against Serena Williams, right? One of the most famous tennis players right now that a lot of people, at least I don't know tennis, but like I know Serena Williams, and I think a lot of people who don't know tennis know Serena Williams because she has such a big name to her. When Naomi Osaka won against her, that is when Japan as a nation as a whole started accepting her. But here's the kick that was really interesting is that when they accepted her, they also dropped her non-Japanese side. So she went from being, you are not Japanese because you are Black, you are biracial, to you are Japanese, fully Japanese. Don't even talk about the other side of you. Don't even talk about the Haitian aspect of you, right? And so, and you could see, I think it was 2018 or 2019, there was a ad that she was supposed to be featured in, but it was an animation. I think the company was Nissan, so Nissan, and they had an ad of her, playing tennis, but they had whitewashed her. They made her skin more pale than she is. So they lightened her skin to make her look, I wouldn't say white, but I would say probably more probably Japanese-ish, or just less black than how she really is. And a lot of people talked about it. She even, had her comments on it, and they had apologized and took down the ad. But things like that, where they try to enhance her Japanese-ness, because now she is representing Japan. And I think recently too, I can double check this as well and put it in the comments. But when I was doing research about her, there was this thing where because she had dual citizenship, she had to choose between her citizenship, whether her Japanese citizenship, and I think it was a Haitian citizenship or American citizenship. I think it was Haitian. And she had to choose between the two of them. And in order for her to play in Japan, she ended up having to drop the non-Japanese citizenship. So that whole situation was particularly interesting to me, because kind of going in line with what Kay was talking about. I know we're talking about it in more of a sports or pop culture-esque, but in order for biracial individuals to be seen as something, as more part of the in-group. So it was the U.S. citizenship. Thank you. So her U.S. citizenship that she had to drop in order to play tennis in Japan. I'm talking about Naomi Osaka here. But what was really interesting about more so Naomi Osaka, less so about Ariana Miyamoto, but still those two experiences, what they illustrate is that you won't be, if you are a biracial individual, at least in Japan, you won't be considered fully Japanese or fully accepted. Even if they say that they want you, even if they say that they appreciate you being there, or even if they, say you are still loved in this country, you won't necessarily be fully accepted into the culture unless you are seen as being, useful for them. So for Naomi Osaka, her usefulness came after the fact that she won against Serena Williams. And not only did she become useful, she became fully Japanese. Right, which is why I think it was so amazing of her, Naomi Osaka, so amazing of her to have those masks. If you ever seen Naomi Osaka recently, playing with a mask that had all the names of the Black individuals who were killed in America due to police violence, and so her using that platform in order to bring awareness, even in Japan, it was very amazing and honestly beautiful of her to do that. But I think it's also really important that Japan needs to be aware and have these conversations about the way that they treat biracial individuals. So even if they feel like they are not necessarily treating them negatively because they're, supporting people like Naomi Osaka, what was really important from the discourse of the ad that I saw was that a lot of people were like, yeah, there's no, discrimination in Japan, but you look at the experiences of Naomi Osaka and Ariana Miyamoto, and you see how many people sort of give backlash against them because of the fact that they don't see them as Japanese is problematic, especially when Japan in and of itself is becoming multicultural, even if it's kind of something that they claim that they don't really want, but they need. They're becoming multicultural, right? Like they're having a lot of foreigners come into Japan, whether they're foreigners from the Western Hemisphere or from other Asian countries. They're coming into Japan, they're settling in Japan, they're getting jobs, they're going through the educational system, they get married. Like there's a lot of people who are not ethnically Japanese who are living in Japan, who are going through the experience of, what it's like to be in Japan. But you have those who are biracial, not seen as fully Japanese, even if their entire life they've been in Japan. And for those who are, for example, I don't know about like Asian mix Japanese, biracial Japanese individuals, so like Korean and Japanese, or Thai and Japanese, but those who are Black and Japanese or white and Japanese, there is this like kind of, how would you call it, like a push for them to go in the sports, a push for them to be a singer, a push for them to go somewhere where they could seem their whatever it is that they are stereotyped as can be seen as a commodity. And I think that's a really problematic thing, because biracial individuals can't just be, they can't just be humans living on an island, essentially, because Japan is an island, living their life. And unless they go through those different routes of getting money, for example, being a rapper or whatever, they won't ever be seen as fully Japanese on the everyday lived experiences. And I think that's a really big problem that I think Naomi Osaka and Ariana Miyamoto actually brings out. So I'm going to stop here because there are other examples that we can give, but I wanted to highlight those two individuals in Japan. But I'm going to let Rai hop in on here.
Thank you. I feel like you brought up so many great points. And I also, it reminded me of, I've been kind of keeping up with Naomi Osaka since she did win against Serena Williams that first time, because she was so young and I had never heard of her before. And I was like, she beat Serena Williams. But I remember very shortly after she had won, there was that big push in Japan where she was like, oh my gosh, she's Japanese. Haha, we take credit for this. But there was also, I watched this street interview around the time when she was getting close to the kind of deadline to decide which citizenship she would choose between US and Japanese citizenship. I think it might be like 20 years old, 21 is when you have to decide. But it was a street interview in Japan asking people what citizenship they thought she should choose. And it was very interesting because, of course, there was a lot of like national pride about Naomi Osaka being Japanese, and she won this big tennis match, and she's so like famous now. But almost everyone was like, "Oh, she should choose the American citizenship." Duh. And one of the most common reasons was she's like one of them, So it was interesting to think like, yes, she is Japanese as long as we can take credit for that accomplishment and we can feel national pride. But at the same time, she's that non-Japanese side of her, that other half is never fully forgotten, right? It might be pushed to the side to make the conversation more comfortable for a moment, but I don't think that it's ever actually forgotten. I think the street interview was on the YouTube channel Asian Boss, who I love. I love Asian Boss interviews. They give me life. But it's also, I believe, fairly similar in Korea, to the extent that, I mean, we're speaking largely about like phenotypically different from, ethnically entirely Japanese or entirely Korean, right? But I have also done some reading on how deeply entrenched the idea of kind of one ethnic basis is in Korean society, to the point where their word for like mixed race is, I think it technically translates to mixed blood, but it encompasses anyone who is phenotypically different, yes, but also just anyone who is nationality wise. It could be from another East Asian country. You could look entirely Korean, but you're still Honhyeo, So you are mixed blood. There's a bit of a, almost like a one drop rule kind of situation where as long as you're not 100% Korean, you're not really fully Korean. Your citizenship encompasses both, yes, an ethnic identity, but it's also a national one, and those two things have to coincide. And if they don't, then you're never going to be fully seen as Korean. When I was in Korea, taking an anthropology class, my professor, who was a white woman, she was like, so, to the Korean students in the class, do you think I could ever be Korean? And, there are some very polite Korean students in the class who are like, yeah, I mean, if you go through like the system and you get the citizenship, I guess. And she's like, That's very nice of you. If you saw me on the street, would you think I was Korean? No. The answer is just very easily no. And the truth is that we don't know the nationalities, legal citizenships of people we see on the streets. This is not to say that, you know, in America, for instance, that there are not people who judge on the basis of looks whether or not someone is like a rightful citizen. I personally don't. I'm like, I don't know, you're here. But I'm also here. I don't know how that happened, but I also know that it's perhaps less common here to have that kind of prejudgment of someone's citizenship or belonging based on phenotype, simply because many areas in the United States have been more culturally and ethnically diverse for a long time. That doesn't mean that those prejudices don't exist still, predominantly in like overwhelmingly white areas of America, rural areas. I think that there's definitely still that strong kind of link to like American identity is somehow tied in with whiteness, which was like never true. I mean, like, as far as actually who was here, like, it was never just white people. We can just leave that out there. But it's still fairly new for societies like Korea and Japan as far as the global history is concerned. And so people, even those who are, say, half Japanese, or even, how do I explain this concept? Somebody who was ethnically Korean but immigrated to China before the end of Joseon era, which was like the last dynasty in Korea. They can be fully ethnically Korean, but they're like kind of in the Korean imaginary, they're kind of Chinese, but kind of Korean. They're something else entirely. They're Joseon people. And so even then and there, according to some readings that I've been looking into, you can still be considered foreign, even if you have the Korean citizenship, and also you're fully ethnically Korean. If you were, you know, born and raised outside of Korea, you might always be different or considered to be different. But I know that I said a lot, and I want to give Kay a chance to jump in here.
You said a lot, but a lot of things that were important, and my mind was just like kept going, and just like, you remember we were talking about how like some of us are bullet pointed people. I'm definitely the air bubble person. Like I have to like create thoughts and they just jump out of each other. But I think you bring up a lot of interesting points in correlating that to American culture and like not American culture, but not just American culture, but just like American like identity and like who can claim themselves as American. And I feel like in America, we might have that attitude that like, oh, well, this is America. It's a melting pot of different cultures and ethnicities and people from different parts of the world. We ought to accept them, but that doesn't happen, right? And so I think for someone that, me personally, I come from a multi-ethnic household where I'm not just American, I'm not just African American, but I'm also Caribbean. And to have a parent who recently just got naturalized, so to my parent, my dad, and I'm so proud of him. I think there is still a stigma against folks who may look like they belong here, but might not have the proper documentation, and that might not be physically a thing, but it's definitely a hindrance when you're looking for jobs and like people asking you for, you know, certain documentation to prove your citizenship, right? It comes along in many different ways. Even if you have an accent, right? You could be born and raised here in America, but your accent is throwing everyone off. So they have to like double check to make sure that you are right where you belong. And so I don't know, I was just thinking about that and how it might translate into conversations about race in Korea. And I think, ooh, that's very interesting. Yes. I think about conversations of race in Korea and how there are different ways that are there that allows those foreigners who might have Korean blood to kind of reassimilate within the Korean culture so they don't look or seem or come across as socially different. And I say socially because it's like it's a cultural thing, right? Like, do you do the same thing that we do? Do you walk the same way we walk? Do you dress the same way we dress? Do you talk the same way we talk, right? I think like different forms of the language and utilizing that in your day-to-day can definitely point you out as a person that's either, you know, Korean or not, or American or not, and or Black or not. You know, I definitely think that it streamlines into many cultures in the way that we identify one another and categorize one another. But I say that to say this is that we're in a time now where we're trying to build a consciousness about race, and it's very difficult because I don't think anyone feels comfortable with that. You know, and I think we're treading on some waters where it's like we want to push the boundaries a little bit and have these conversations that need to be had, because how else are we going to move the needle forward and making sure that people who come from mixed identities or people who don't can feel accepted no matter where they go. And I think it comes from a very personal place as well, simply because we are travelers and we've been around the world and we've seen things, and our viewers, you know, come from different parts of the world. And I think we want to connect the two things that might seem very different, and like there's a huge gap between what we're experiencing and what we're noticing there. We don't want to have like this like armchair kind of observance type of way that they categorize a lot of like anthropologists, that, you know, you sit down in the chair and you just observe with your eyes and just see what happens. But no, you have to be interactive, you have to be involved, and it has to come from real experiences. And I want to bring this to another YouTube project, the Happy Project, which we brought up quite a bit on this channel. And I think they make a lot of interesting claims and have quite profound discourse with people who live day to day in South Korea, and might have, you know, themselves be both Korean and you know, identify something outside of Korea. But then they also have children where they might just be completely foreign, right? And they have a child that's half Korean, and they're trying to figure out the best way to have a conversation with their children about this. And I think because, thank God, we live in a different generation, we can kind of deflect these negative experiences and trying to bring a little bit more positivity into it, and by being real, right? Like, we've had this conversation before, and I'm trying to tread lightly because I know we're kind of want to talk about this at another time, but like the way that maybe Koreans or like Japanese people or Chinese people or anyone in Eastern Asia, because I feel like they definitely carry the weight in terms of projecting beauty standards. They carry the weight in terms of like who they believe is accepting, who they believe should be accepting like these norms or like standards of beauty, or kind of like the way of being living in these countries, or like the status quo, right? Because I do think that there is maybe some sort of disparity between what South Asian cultures are experiencing and their way of identifying what is beauty and things like that, which we'll definitely hold on to and carry on further in our conversation. But I think like it's hard. I don't know. I'm just coming out from like a real standpoint because I don't really have like a profound analytical standpoint. But what I do want to bring up and claim is that like these individuals that, you know, have to battle with the government and deciding like if they're able to stay or not based off of their citizenship, it's like, why give them this harsh kind of like decision to make about their identity, their culture, like having to claim one more than the other. Is that ethically or morally correct, right? Is that, are we going to start living in a society where we feel that now all of a sudden you have to prove everything about yourself, like on a profile sheet, and then like what makes you unique and what makes you different? And I don't know, it's just, there's a lot going on in my head, and I haven't really formulated it because I can only come from my own experience and just like what we have heard and like seen through street interviews, through YouTube, and then also like having our own personal conversations with people who live in Korea or in Japan and at a cafe and like having these 101s. So kind of just want to like bring everyone to that attention about the way that molds or shapes relationships, continentally and like racially, ethnically. Is like, are we aware that are these countries having like actual discourse about race when you're living in a ethnically homogenous society, or at least recognized as ethnically homogenous, and then just like throwing everything else under the rug and letting it kind of go away at another time. So yeah. And hello, Kamari, nice to see you. And Rai, I know you wanted to mention something as well.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, we do have this idea of places like Japan and South Korea being ethnically homogenous, right?
Mm-hmm.
In academia, it's generally discussed that that's largely a myth. The idea of these ethnically homogenous societies is, it's largely a projection from the nation state itself, right? Um, and in large part, that's because the ethnic identity is tied so strongly to national identity and ideas of citizenship, right? But it just makes me think back to, someone like Naomi Osaka, who had to choose a citizenship, right? And up until that point in her life, whatever it was, 20, 21 years old, she was allowed fully to be both of those things on like documentation. What we tend to see as like the end all be all of um, like legal security, right? And I think about how these America, the United States, I'll say, does allow dual citizenship. And there are a lot of European countries that allow dual citizenship. But what's notable about Japan and South Korea is that they do allow dual citizenship up to a certain age, at which point you have to choose. And they have their own reasons for that, mainly being you might be half like ethnically, Japanese or Korean, and you might be born somewhere else. And you're still allowed to hold on to that until you like get familiar with both of the cultures and make that decision. In Korea, it largely ties to the Korean War and the modern practices of enlistment, right? For Korean men, you can't hold on to your Korean citizenship past the age of like 18 for men, and I think it's 20 for women. And the 18 for men is because that is the age at which you start being considered for enlistment in the military for your, about 2-year military service. And there are very heated debates in Korea about maybe someone is like a. I did hear a lot. This is obviously I'm not Korean. I'm not. I don't mean to say obviously but like I've talked about being American, so but I did when I was there, and even from corresponding with people after I left Korea, I did hear a lot of discourse about kind of like national like traitors, someone who maybe they had a dual citizenship or and they chose the non-Korean citizenship in particular to avoid military service. And that ties into a whole, we could even bring that back to K-pop, but I'm not gonna. Not now. But this idea that maybe you fall in love with someone who is a foreign national and you move to their country and you take on their citizenship, right? And you lose your Korean citizenship. You are a traitor. There's a lot of people who feel very betrayed by that decision. Obviously, not to say all of them do, but it's a very hot topic about, like, are you even Korean? Like, that's your duty to the state, to your nation, to your people. And this really ties into what Kay was saying about, we tend to, like, make people jump through these incredibly difficult hoops, like hoops are on fire, in order to kind of prove themselves to the nation state, to earn citizenship, or maybe just by luck, by chance, they're born in a certain place and they receive that citizenship. And many in these cases, for particularly countries that are newer to practices of multiculturalism, at least upfront efforts towards multiculturalism, because, as I did say, they have been multicultural, even if it's not, well known. That those hoops that you're jumping through, and the weight of your identity falls into balance, and you have to navigate such difficult and turbulent conversations and political environments just to be even partially accepted by a nation state or by a people. And I find that is something that we as foreigners can definitely look at from our own perspective in America, and we can say, yes, we recognize that, even within our own country. But then we also have to view it from a different perspective now, as outsiders outsiders from Korean and Japanese society, these places that we've taken interest in, and we are now navigating that from the other, what feels like the other side, and I feel like that's it's humbling in a way, right? Maybe to consider national identity in a way that you've never had to before, and you'll be faced with it probably every day in these cultures, whether that be good or bad. I don't know if either of you want to jump in on that.
Not on that point per se, because I do want to get into colorism. So Kay, if you have something that you want to add to what Rai said, and then I can jump in on kind of similar to the conversation about, like, who has a place or who's more accepted versus others, but through the lens of colorism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still trying to think of like parallels, and I do understand where you're talking about. I feel like we're on the same page about kind of the mission of acceptance, right, in these countries, and like what that looks like politically and culturally and socially in these countries. So yeah, if you want to go ahead and bring in that new example, I think that would be really great, because I think it will definitely tie into what we're trying to eventually talk about, and its relationship to like popular culture and like what's going to be seen and how it's going to be seen, and does this at all reject our claims about who has a place in K-pop. Yeah.
So sorry, my mom is trying to get my brother to eat food, but yeah, I wanted, because the colorism aspect that I was thinking about actually does touch a little bit about like who is accepted and who isn't. or who is more useful versus others, even on the everyday lived experiences. And I think that um, colorism is a pretty interesting thing to dive into. And I'm not going to go into a long history about colorism or anything like that. But the reason why I bring it up is because for biracial individuals, at least in Japan, because I don't know a lot about South Korea and the way that they treat the biracial individuals. So both of you have been super, super informative in that sense for me. But for at least in Japan, because even though on a larger scale, if you are simply like, if you're biracial, like there is that conversation about like you're not Japanese enough, but there is much more acceptance towards biracial individuals who are Japanese and white. Or it's not even just acceptance, but it's kind of like we allow you to be. We want you to be a model, but we allow you to be. As opposed to if you are a Japanese and black or Japanese and darker skinned, it's kind of like we don't accept you or we don't see you as Japanese when we first look at you, even if you lived here your entire life. So going along the lines of Rai's example about, the teacher asking like, would you think of me as ethnically Japanese, Korean, South Korean, if you were to see me on the streets? Like a lot of biracial individuals who were darker skin won't necessarily have that opportunity to just be. It's kind of like you can be as long as you are useful. Obviously, that kind of discourse is not necessarily well spread everywhere and things the same because people are still people will still have different ideas of who's accepted and who's not. But on a larger scale, I saw that difference in acceptance. And when I was reading a lot about the hafu experience, hafu is what they're called in Japan, even though right now there is a little bit of a push to be called w, but I don't know if that's getting a lot of attraction. But I know I know that there's that. So those of you who don't know, all our viewers who don't know what the difference between hafu and w is hafu is in English is called half is half. And so the idea is that you are half one and half the other. But the discourse on w is that a lot of hafus are saying that they're not half anything, they're full people. In fact, they're double of both countries. So they're trying to adopt the title of w. So I say hafu because I've heard it more used, but I just want to acknowledge that that discourse. But either way, that there are still that difference in treatment based off of what kind of hafu you are. And I want to highlight Kay because Kay, you said specific roles, and I think that's a perfect way to acknowledge what's happening. Is that like if you are a black hafu or darker skin hafu, there is that sort of specific role that people expect you to play into, versus if you are not in that category, there is that sort of push to get a specific role, but you are still allowed to be who you want to be. You're still allowed to be who you are. Versus if you are, let's say, Japanese and another ethnically Asian, not ethnically, racially Asian individual, if you don't make it known that you are hafu, and if you look the part of Japanese, it's kind of like you can just live your life as a Japanese person. So there is that difference in experiences in Japan. But I think the reason why I want to bring this up is because that kind of colorism, even if it doesn't exist in that same scale, exists in K-pop. When we even see the difference in experiences or treatment of biracial individuals in the K-pop world. And so I just wanted to bring in colorism into that, to just talk about like the nuances and who is being accepted. Because even if like overall we're talking about like the biracial the experience, we can easily say that like not every experience is the same, and it could be differentiated by what kind of hafu you are. So I don't know if anybody want to hop on to that.
I mean, I think that is definitely true. No one can deny that colorism exists in K-pop. I mean, even among the K-pop idols who are fully ethnically Korean, those with darker skin tones, the attention drawn to that fact and the idea that that somehow makes them more suited to, say, like a sexy concept as opposed to a cutesy one, it's pervasive. I'm thinking Kai from EXO, everyone when they first debuted was like, oh, his skin, it's so sexy, that makes him so well suited to his role. There's Hwasa from Mamamoo. Kay has mentioned Hyorin as well. They all fall into this kind of trope of like the sexy one. It's, I think, the only example I can think of that was not in the sexy role was I don't remember the group's name, but there was a song called like Love Shoot and it was really cute. But if anyone watching knows what that group is, tell me. But there was one member who had like a noticeably darker skin tone, and she just was cute like the rest and was allowed to be cute. But I also find that you're absolutely right, especially when we think of, it's interesting, I think that I see more half white, half Korean idols and like entertainers in Korea, models even, more so than, I guess there's like Sam Hamilton is like a fully white. Laboom, yes, Laboom. Kay just messaged me. The group's name was Laboom, yes. And then we think of the almost like hyper visibility of Fatou in Black Swan, right? Versus the near invisibility of Leia. Like no one talks. I don't want to be disrespectful. I'm sure she's worked very hard, but the discourse is not about her, right? The discourse is about Fatou. It's like, oh, she's not only fully Black, but she's Senegalese in particular. She speaks this many languages. She, the name kind of Black Swan, this image that they're trying to present. She can't just be just a regular person. Chai is definitely kind of on that wavelength. She has to be representative of so much more. Meanwhile, Leia, as a half white, half Japanese idol, is far less unusual. I can think of several examples, off the top of my head, like Somi, for instance, or Shannon. What was her name? Shannon Williams? Was that her last name? I don't know.
Yeah, and go ahead.
No, I mean, you can jump in here, but I'm just thinking there are so many examples of the half white idol or entertainer, and I can't actually think right now, other than Lee Michelle, of a half Black Korean idol. And Lee Michelle is not very mainstream the same way like Somi and Shannon are. I think that she had to like change her entire, approach to music and K-pop in order to even get some semblance of visibility on the scene. So I think that speaks a lot to the colorism, and also potentially to the idea of like, Koreanness or mixed Asianness in general. So I would love to hear your thoughts, Chai, on that.
Yeah, I think when you say like beauty standards, it kind of like linked back to the conversations that we had one earlier, but also just like constantly about like, the beauty standards, as we all know, because we engage in K-pop, and what you alluded to, right, or not even alluded to, what you said about, like, if you're darker skinned, you are oftentimes like able to do more of like the cute, not the cutesy, the sexy, mysterious, hot kind of elements, versus like lighter skin, you're more cutesy, bubbly kind of things. And I think that even ties into more, again, like the beauty standards, but also the ways in which just like foreigners themselves are treated, right? Like, Black individuals Black individuals, especially darker skinned Blacks, not only are you seen as like sexy, but you're seen as exotic, erotic, voluptuous, somebody for sexual gratification. Obviously not all the time, but this is a trend, and that's what I also want to like highlight, because not every Black experience is the same, as well as not every foreign experience is the same. Not every hafu who are in certain groups are the same, but there is a trend, there is a consistency that we've seen. So I just saw a comment from one of our podcasters, and that made me pause, because that is something to question. I'm gonna let Kay.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry at all. Like, I think that you should definitely bring that into the conversation if you feel comfortable, because not forcing you to do anything. But I think it's really important to like think about how individuals who are on the darker skin are typically treated versus those who are on the lighter skin, and how people try to navigate around that as if that doesn't exist, right? To exist, like, for example, beauty standards is just a preference of one individual, or that the way that they use lighter skinned individuals to essentially be the face of beauty, right? And to say, like, even if they're not saying it directly, but to use them in almost a lot of different ways, and videos and concepts, modeling, it creates this overarching message that this is what beauty is. And South Korea, by doing that, you in and of itself create a larger understanding of what beauty is and what people should strive towards, and that everything opposite of that is not beautiful. Or if it's not beautiful, it may not be beautiful, but it may be sexy. It may be good for like the one time purpose, but it's not good enough. It doesn't meet a certain standards. Or if it's on the opposite, it's opposite enough to be fetishized. And so there is a lot of points that I brought up in there, which is why I brought up colorism, because I think it leads into a lot of other conversations that we also want to talk about. But that difference in treatment versus light-skinned white individuals or dark-skinned Black individuals and everybody in the middle, because they fall in line in these kind of different what is spectrum within this spectrum, it kind of in and of itself dictates how somebody will perceive you, and how that perception is going to lead to a certain interaction with you. So I got Goffman in my head, but that's what that's where I was coming from. But Kay, if you want to bring up what you was talking about in the chat, but I told you.
No, I feel like we're touching on something that's very controversial, and very popular. Hence why there's like a lot of media platforms on YouTube, like groups, they tend to talk about preferences, and that's like one of the biggest things that kind of like led to this conversation as well, regarding like colorism. And not for nothing, most of the women in these examples are not darker skinned Black women, and even if there is that one image is not enough for them to curve their understanding of colorism and just like correcting beauty standards, right? It's like, we recognize that there are other people that may look different, but like, this is what I'll settle for, kind of sounded like in those videos. But not that it did not bring awareness, but I do think though it probably didn't leave a pleasant taste in my mouth afterwards, just knowing that like it's comparable and we're always going to be compared against one another. But that's neither here or there. What I really wanted to touch upon was the fact of the matter that like there is no real discussion about race. And I feel like not that I'm the type of person that brings it up in every conversation, in every instance that I do, you know, like, you know, my job is to enlighten people that I interact with on a daily basis about race. That's not it. But I definitely thought that one of the more interesting things that I've encountered living in Asia was less about my race. Like, they might have assumed that I came from a certain country, like Africa mostly. But the way that I was kind of like categorized based off of beauty standards, excuse me, was cutesy sexy. And I didn't really know how to take that. And I've heard that in many different contexts. That be like, oh, wow, you're just so cute. Like, wow. And then there's like, go to a club. And then it's like, oh, hey, sexy girl, how you doing? And it's just like, it came across, like, both of them came across like differently in like two different scenarios. But when I've heard it both together at the same time, I was like, well, what does that mean? And when I would ask that question, it was more like, oh, like, you know, you have a small face and you're just so cute and bubbly and, you know, you smile a lot and, but like, you have a nice body, you know. It became like, I don't really know how to put this, but it was just like interesting to have to be identified not solely based off of my kind of like skin color, but also like what I look like. And I've never had to be read like that before, y'all. To be read for what I look like, and, you know, not for other things, which I'm grateful for, because I hope that I didn't come across as a negative person while living in these countries. I was just genuinely curious. So I would always ask, like, why? Like, why would that be the case? Or why do you think you carry these stereotypes about Black people, or just like Black women specifically? Because that's exactly what I am. And I can't speak for every Black woman's experience, but it was definitely interesting. I've never had that experience here in America, aside from, you know, like occasional catcalling, or like my own experience with colorism within my own community is drastically different. And to hear kind of nuances of that in South Korea was also pretty jarring as well. Especially when there's a country where we're not having conversations about race and having to like educate and explain, you know, how their words make me feel about certain things, was definitely a learning experience for all of us. And I think I walked away with that, like, being more open-minded, but also just more curious, and just like led to me like asking more questions that kind of was deep rooted into the conversation. Well, have you ever like lived outside of the confines of your community? And do you know what the real experience is like for other people, even like Koreans who live abroad? Like, do you know what they're experiencing as Korean Americans, or Korean British Koreans, or, you know, Koreans living in South America? Like, we all have different experiences, no matter if we share the same ethnic background. It's profound to me. So I'll let Chai jump in, because I know you got heated when I said that.
Yeah, no, because when you said cutesy sexy, the first thing that I thought about, like, it wasn't, the phrase wasn't used, but the first thing that I thought about were those Korean models, male models who have like a baby face, but their body is like, you know, wow, that was so weird. But like, you know, like, they work out. I know that was, sorry viewers, but you know, like, their face is like, you know, kind of like a child-esque, or like they're kind of chubby or whatever. It's just like a cute, adorable face. And then you just, because they work out, the body is like, you know, stuff like that. So that's what I was thinking. So it was really interesting to hear that that phrase and your experience, and how they try to use it, where it's like, yeah, you're cute because of your personality and maybe even your face, but you're also sexy because of your body. It's just, I don't know what else to say to that. I just wanted to bring that up, just as a laugh, not really as a point to bring up, but that's as a laugh of like how I imagined the word itself.
Yeah, you could imagine how I felt. I was like,
I was like, what? I was like, hey, you got ass down? Wait, what?
I wish.
But with that, I am sad to say that we're coming to an end. We had so much that we wanted to share with you all. Actually, we have more. We kind of over prepared for today's conversation, so we're going to be bringing this up next week as a more of a continuation of who has a place in K-pop. Uh, oh, that was so bad. Yeah, I'm so old, y'all. Um, but but yeah, I just want to thank all our viewers, especially those who are new to our channel. Thank you so much for engaging with us. Your comments have been very enlightening and beautiful. Thank you so much. I hope to see you all this Friday. Actually, we were having another podcast. We're going back to our normal time, as I said earlier, at 5:30. I won't say on the dot because sometimes we late. But it's all right because we bring in the tea. Hey, uh, you know I have orange juice next to me, so I can't show my cup. But but again, thank you all. Thank you. We all look forward to seeing you all again and engaging with you. But thank you. Have a great evening or morning or afternoon wherever you're watching it. Thank you.
Subscribe if you haven't.
Subscribe, click like, share, everything. Thank
All right,
you.
thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.